My name's Dan Ogilvie. I'm Managing Director of Sigma Electronics. And in this video, I'm going to try and explain what AHD, HD-CVI and HD-TVI are, how they're different to NTSC, is one better than the other. To begin with, we really have to go back quite a long time to the invention, if you like, of what's called CVBS video. CVBS. And this is a generic term that encompasses the known videos such as NTSC and PAL. C stands for color, V stands for video, B for blanking, S for sync. And it's basically a way of combining all of those necessary parameters so that we can transmit a complete video signal, color, luminance, the black and white amplitudes, the synchronization information, as well as the what is active video and what is not active video. So NTSC and PAL can be transmitted, as you probably know, across a single wire, a single piece of coaxial cable. And when we moved to high definition, that was no longer possible. There was no format. So let's just have a look at the NTSC or PAL signal to begin with. For the purposes of this description, we can view them as both the same. The principles are the same anyway. So if we take a normal television screen, like so, we have a horizontal direction here and a vertical direction here. The horizontal direction is the faster frequency. And when we look at a pointer camera at an image, we scan that image. We scan it by starting at the top left, and then we scan from left to right, and then we move down a little bit, and then we scan from left to right, and so on until we get to the bottom of the picture. And then we go back up there and we scan again. Now for PAL, no, let's do NTSC, it's simpler. So for NTSC, there are 525 of these scan lines, and each scan line in the digital domain has 720 pixels, active dots, if you like, across that line. So there's 720 samples of that video that are taken. If you work out this frequency, you will see that what we actually do is we scan those 525 lines over a period of 30 frames per second. And a frame is one complete scan of 525 lines. So we do that 30 times a second. There is interlace and that involved, but again, it's not necessary to know about that for the purposes of this discussion. If we scan much slower than 30 frames per second, we start getting the old Charlie Chaplin movies where you can actually see people moving. At 30 frames a second, you would be able to still see that motion, but the interlace that is there prevents that. It sort of masks it. But ideally, we really need to move at 50 to 60 frames per second so that the motion becomes more continuous and we don't see the jerk motion as we move from one frame to the next. So this is our synchronization information. So if we transmit this at the other end, at our TV monitor, we need to know where those pixels are. We need to know where the top left is. We need to know what line we're on. And that's the synchronization information that's sent. And it's sent by using a horizontal sync pulse like this. This pulse, the falling edge of this pulse, constitutes the left side of the picture, and then this constitutes the next line. So this, from here to here, is one line of the video. And so this indicates the left position, and to indicate the top position, a big fat pulse is sent. It's actually, again, more detailed than that, but for now we can assume that. So when we see the big fat pulse, the wide pulse, we know that this edge here constitutes us resetting back up to line 1 here. And then we have more of the shorter pulses like this, which take us down the line. So this is the synchronization information. On top of the synchronization information, we obviously now need to send picture information. Now, to begin with, and at the beginning of television, we didn't transmit color, we only transmitted what's called luminance, black and white information. So if we just look across one line here, again, and let's assume we had a very simple picture here. Let's assume that all of this is black, apart from here, where we have a white bar. So this is all black, this is all black, and we have a white bar running down the screen. So what we do is we put the video on top of the synchronization information. So looking across here, black is now defined as being at the level of the top of the sync pulse, and above that we would see that white pulse. And if instead of black here we had black at the left, and then we slowly increased up to the peak white level, and then we come back down again, then we'd see that sort of waveform. So the amplitude above the sync indicates how bright the picture is. At the top here it's white, at the bottom here it's black, and in between, as it's an analog signal, whatever this voltage is represents a dark grey or a light grey or anything in between. So here we've now been able to send, using this composite pulse, we now can synchronize the transmitter, the camera, with the receiver, the monitor or the recorder, and we can transmit across the same cable information about the brightness of the scene that we're looking at. Now we want to transmit color, and now it becomes a lot more complicated. And part of that complication is because everyone, well, a lot of people had bought black and white televisions. And what they didn't want to do is now transmit a completely separate signal that was the color signal. So they wanted to transmit the color signal on top of the black and white signal that was already being sent to all these black and white televisions that people had bought. But obviously it mustn't corrupt or make worse the black and white signal. So that was quite a difficult thing to do. I think television is probably the greatest invention of the 20th century. And I think GPS is up there as well. But I think my own vote would be for the whiteboard. So we have a black and white signal, we have the synchronization signal. Now we need to transmit color. Well, the way to transmit color, if all my pens are working, is to basically have 3 cameras. like so. And all of these cameras are aligned, so they're looking at exactly the same part of the video, the picture that you're looking at, the image. So here we have just the red component, so we'll see everything that's red that's in the image, and the same for the green and the same for the blue. If we actually combine these signals together, not in a 1-to-1 ratio, but using weighting factors, then we can get the same black and white signal as if we had a non-color camera. And this is the key to how we transmit color, yet make it compatible with the old black and white TVs. So if we take these signals and add them together, but again, this is not 30%, 30%, 30%. These have different weightings. They're weightings that depend on the sensitivity of the eye to color. The eye is more sensitive to some colors than other colors. So these weightings are determined by how our eye sees color and the sensitivity to red, green and blue. If we add these together, we end up with the luminance, the black and white signal, the signal that indicates what's white and what's grey and such like. The terminology for that is to call it the Y signal. So now we have the red, green and blue signals. If we take, for example, the red signal, and from that we subtract this constructed luminance signal, because the red signal contains not just the color red, but it also contains the Y part of the Y signal, the amplitude, how bright the signal is. So this signal is only how bright it is. This signal contains no color. It's only how bright the signal is. So if we subtract that from the red, this signal is called R minus Y, and this signal only contains color information because we've subtracted the luminance information. Let's do the same thing with the blue signal. So the blue signal comes in here, and we subtract the luminance to produce a B minus Y signal. And this only contains color information of the blue spectrum. Now, we go back to the eye. The eye is not actually very sensitive to color. The example of that is if you go out and it's really dark at night, you don't see any color. Everything's in black and white. We only, in low light conditions, we see no color at all. We have much less color receptors in the eye than we do what are luminance receptors, because the eye is exactly like this. The eye has a black and white sensor, and then it has color sensors. And it has much less color sensors than it has black and white sensors. We don't care the color of the lion that's about to eat us. We only care that we can see the lion and see that it's moving towards us. So that's the evolutionary sort of background to this. That means that we need a lot of information here, as much as we can get, which tells us all the detail that's in the image. But the color is like a broad brush stroke. So this is like a fine pencil, and this is like a really wide paintbrush that just slaps on the color. In electronics terms, it means that we need a lot of bandwidth to send this signal, but we don't need so much bandwidth to send the color signals. And you may be aware that this signal is about 5 megahertz in bandwidth, whereas these signals are only about 1.3 megahertz. However, we haven't really helped ourselves by being able to transmit across a single piece of wire. But what we have done, we need to transmit the Y signal, and now we need to transmit the color signal. But what we've done here is we've created two color signals that are now lower bandwidth. We don't need to do the same thing with the green signal, because with a little bit of arithmetic, we know the Y signal, we know the R minus Y and the B minus Y, so we can derive the G minus Y signal from that. So now we've only got two low bandwidth signals, and we have the luminance signal. So just to remind you, there's our horizontal sync pulses, and this is our luminance signal here. Still no color. If we were to transmit these two signals and this one, we'd still need 3 cables to do it. So we need to find a way of transmitting these two signals superimposed, if you like, on this, the black and white signal and the synchronizing signals. And the way that this is done is called quadrature modulation. What's done is to create a sine wave, like so. And then we create a cosine wave, and I'm going to draw this really badly, but you're aware that it sort of, I'm already out of this, but anyway, it's 90 degrees out of phase with the sine wave. So something like that. So that's your cosine wave, and that's your sine wave. And what we do is we amplitude modulate the R minus Y signal on the sine. It may be the cos. The principle's the same. And the B minus Y signal on the other one, on the cos or the sine, whichever is not done for the R minus Y. And they're amplitude modulated. So the amplitude of the sine wave will be up and down depending with how much red there is in the video. And the cosine wave, assuming I've got it the right way around, is amplitude modulated with the amplitude of the blue. And we know that we can get the green back by taking away the Y signal from the R minus Y and the B minus Y and doing a little bit of arithmetic. What frequency is this sine wave and the cosine wave? Well, if we look at I've already mentioned that the luminance signal basically goes up to about 5 megahertz. We can't go beyond that because transmitting NTSC and PAL, there are other things that were transmitted like audio, and the audio was actually transmitted on a carrier just above there. So we can't put a carrier up here. In other words, the carrier, the frequency that the sine wave and the cos wave is at, cannot be any further up. And anyway, then a little bit further up, we've got other channels and things that transmit other stuff. Governments are very protective of their frequencies. Most of it is all military stuff and such like. So we have to somehow transmit it down here. And obviously we have the luminance signal there. So what was done was to choose a frequency, and for NTSC it was 3.58 megahertz approximately, and the approximate point of it is very important. That frequency is done so that it's not an integer multiple of any other frequency that's in the spectrum. And because it's a scanned signal, we have 30 Hertz and we have 60 Hertz, which are the frequencies for the vertical component. And then we have about 15 kilohertz, which is the frequency of the horizontal pulse. And we have all the multiples of that. But because it's scanned, we have those multiples. So we can pick a frequency that isn't any of those multiples. And the frequency that's chosen, as I say, is 3.58 da 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 da, and lots of numbers after that. And it's specifically designed so that it doesn't interfere with the luminance signal. And the same for PAL, 4.433, 618, 75, etc. And so we can transmit the sine wave, which is at 3.58 megahertz, and the cosine wave, which is also at 3.58 megahertz, and put them on this frequency here. And we've got less bandwidth here. As I said, it's 1.3 megahertz. So we have the sort of color signal. I've got a colored pen, so I might as well use it. So here is the color signal. And outside of there, all the way up to 5 megahertz, is the black and white signal. But they basically don't interfere with each other. And we can extract the color signal by knowing this frequency precisely. So to transmit the color, we can add the sine wave and the cos wave together because they're 90 degrees apart. So we end up with a composite signal. The sine wave, which is amplitude modulated with the R minus Y, and the cos wave, which is amplitude modulated with the B minus Y, add them together, put them on this carrier, and then we can transmit that. At the same time, we add it into this signal, the black and white signal. And that's the color signal that you see, which is this sine cos wave that is superimposed onto the luminance signal. If there's no color, then you don't see the sine cos wave, you just see the luminance signal. Now, the amplitude of the color is the amplitude of the sine wave or the cos wave. But the phase, the hue of the color, is the phase of the sine or the cos wave. Now, we can't measure phase just by looking at the sine and the cos wave. We've got to have a reference signal that is, say, right, this is 0 degrees, and then look at the phase of this, of the sine wave, for example, with respect to that. So we have to send another little signal out, which is called the color burst. And a little sample of that is sent here, where there's no video. It's called the back porch. So there's no video there at all, no synchronizing pulses. So this is a little sample of this carrier, and it's sent with no phase modulation. But this, which is our real video, is the hue changes depending on the hue of how green or how red or how blue the signal is, or how orange it is. So the hue, the phase here, is the color information. The amplitude is the depth of the color. The luminance signal is underneath that, if you like. So to recover this signal, we just have to precisely create this subcarrier frequency at the receiver, and then we can subtract the chrominance away and we're left with the luminance only. It actually interferes, and there's all sorts of techniques called comb filters and that to try and make a cleaner extraction, but usually there's a bit of chrominance left because we can't get rid of it. After all, it is sitting in the same frequencies. But nonetheless, we have a composite signal that can be sent along one piece of wire that has synchronizing signals, has luminance information, black and white information, has information about the color, And that last thing, the CVBS, that's the blanking signal. That's basically information about where there's no video. In this case, there's no video here because we need to put the color burst there. And vertically, there's also a period where there's no video at the top and bottom of the picture, and other stuff was put in there like closed captions and teletext and that. Again, this goes back to old television days, and everything is derived and constrained by broadcasting television. We're not constrained by that if we actually transmit across a piece of wire. So that's NTSC, and PAL looks pretty similar to that. CCAM's different, and we won't discuss that because no one seems to bother about it anymore, which is a bit of a shame actually, but there you go. So what about AHD and that? Well, high definition, as I've mentioned, does not have a CVBS signal. If you put high definition into the back of your older TVs, you'd have a YPBPR or an RGB interface or something. 3 cables basically, that basically are the 3 signals that come from the separate cameras, the red, green, blue cameras, and the synchronizing signals are put on the green channel. So we need 3 cables. So all those buildings that had been wired in with a single cable for NTSC and PAL, when we went to high definition, well, we have to rip out all those cables and put 3 of them in. So a proposal was made to make a HD version of NTSC. And it can look exactly like NTSC, it's just the frequency changes. So we mentioned before, for NTSC, we had 720 pixels in this direction and 525 lines. So for HD, let's do 720p. So 720p has 750 lines this way, and well, it depends, but active pixels, it has 1280 pixels. But we can transmit it in exactly the same way as we do NTSC. It's just the frequencies change. So we have a faster horizontal frequency because we got more lines to transmit, and we've got more pixels to transmit across horizontally. So the numbers change, but the waveform doesn't need to change at all. We can still have the luminance sat here, and we can still put the chrominance on top. But as we were inventing our own standards, which effectively is what this is, the opportunity could be taken. So this is our luminance signal. Let's just leave it at 5 megahertz for now. But instead of putting that chrominance subcarrier here, we could move it out here, because there's no audio there. There's nothing. Not another channel, no government military transmissions or anything like that. So why don't we do that? Well, the answer is we did. I mean, here at Singmai, we proposed what we called HD-CVI at the time. So without getting into any pedantry about this, Dahua then introduced the identically named HD-CVI. And HD-CVI basically extended this bandwidth a little bit, put the chrominance carrier here above the luminance so they no longer interfered with one another. But the method, this was quadrature modulation. It would just move the frequencies around. So HD-CVI, which was the first thing to be introduced, or the first format to be introduced, is a method of transmitting high definition video that is exactly the same as NTSC, just with different numbers, different subcarrier, different horizontal frequency, different vertical frequency. So then we get the derivatives. I'm not quite sure who came second, but as you know, we have AHD and we have HD-TVI. Now, none of these companies actually provide you with specifications, but they all work on exactly the same principle. They all have a luminance signal here at what's called the baseband. It starts at 0. It extends for some time, and the further it extends, the higher this number is here, the luminance bandwidth, the more detail that you're going to see in the picture. Now, there are SMPTE standards. SMPTE, Society of Motion Picture and Television Experts. There you go. And they define all the video standards that we tend to use, including 720p, 1080p, etc. For 720p and 1080p 30 Hertz, their definition of the luminance bandwidth is that it should be 30 megahertz. And the luminance bandwidth, the chrominance bandwidth, the R minus Y, B minus Y signal, should be half that. Now, none of these formats, to my knowledge, actually achieve that. The only way you're going to achieve that, theoretically, is HD-SDI, the digital non-compressed method of transmitting video. But that's a very high frequency and will go along very short lengths of cable. So that wasn't viable without lots of repeaters and such like, which is why this was introduced. But at no point did this here, did this 5 megahertz become 30 megahertz, and no point did the chrominance become 15 megahertz from where it was for NTSC, if you remember, 1.3 megahertz. I mean, the very early versions of AHD, this was still only about 5 megahertz. But the advantage was the chrominance was not within the luminance bandwidth. So you didn't get the interference anymore, but you weren't getting any more resolution. And so you got different versions, AHD1, AHD2. HD-TVI seems to be the one with the highest frequencies. And the highest frequencies mean more bandwidth, and therefore theoretically more resolution. I say theoretically because it depends on your sensor and all other things as well. This is purely the transmission part of the system. So my understanding, from what I've seen of the numbers of where the subcarrier is that HD-TVI has the highest bandwidth and therefore theoretically should provide the highest, the best resolution. And these two, not much to choose between them. So that in short is a sort of description of what they are. They're basically just, it's your Betamax VHS war again. Non-compatible standards, because once these frequencies change, the horizontal scanning frequencies, of course, can't change. They've got to be 720p or 1280p because they won't plug into your monitor. So these signals look like the G signal of an RGB transmission or the Y signal of a YPB-PR signal, except that you've got this chrominance signal sat on top of it. But if you have an old YPB-PR monitor, you should be able to put AHD or whatever into the Y channel and you should see a picture, but you'll just have no color. You'll just have the black and white and you'll have all this patterning, which is the chrominance part of it, sat on top of that. So the transmission method is exactly the same. There's other bits and pieces that they've added as they tweak the standards and that, and data and audio and other bits and pieces. But the transmission for the video is basically exactly the same as NTSC, just with different numbers. And the only difference between these standards is what the numbers are. And as I say, HD-TVI, to my belief, has the highest chrominance frequency, the subcarrier frequency, and therefore there's more room for more luminance signal, and therefore the resolution should be better. So I hope that's some help in explaining what the difference is between those three standards. And there'll be another video that will later explain what ACVI is, which is what Sing-Mai's alternative to this is. But that isn't based on NTSC. Thanks for listening.